Hi, I'm David Farland. I'm a New York Times bestseller with over 60 novels in print. I've trained hundreds of best-selling authors, including such big names as Brandon Sanderson, James Dashner, Brandon Mull, and Stephanie Meyer. I'm also the lead judge for the world's largest science fiction and fantasy writing contest. Today we're talking about audio fatigue. In Hollywood, it's said that for a major motion picture, you should never set two scenes in the same spot. Visually, it's boring, so much so that viewers become visually fatigued. So you almost never see a movie, something like My Dinner with Andre, where nearly the entire film takes place in a single setting. If two scenes are filmed in the same room, they are often done so at different times of the day, or filmed at different angles, or they're redecorated. Sometimes they're filled with new characters. With stories, we have a similar problem. I call it audio fatigue. It's easy to fall into a routine where we overuse words or repeat words or create characters who all sound the same. It's especially hard for authors to deal with this because the whole novel really does all come from one person's imagination. It's hard for me not to write in my voice. So, let's examine a few ways to avoid creating audio fatigue. First, you can vary your word choices. Many times you'll find that you must use the same words over and over. For example, if two men are trying to fix a radiator on a truck, you'll probably need to say radiator several times on a page. But there are certain words that people frequently overuse. I often find writers who don't seem to have an alternative for look. Their characters never glance, peer, gaze, or stare. Even worse, the author almost always uses look instead of appearance, so that the author says things like, "He looked through the scope of his rifle and saw Sarah. She looked good in her long blue coat. She was looking into her purse for her keys." The reason that words get overused is obvious. Your brain starts searching for a word to describe a noun or action, and it comes up with the first variant in its files. You might have 900,000 neural connections to the word look, and maybe only 50,000 connections to the word peer. So your character ends up looking instead of peering or ogling or gazing or doing something else. These words seem invisible to the author, and there are hundreds of them. Was, were, walked, moved, turned, thought, said, that, just, really, asked, and so on. One author friend of mine made a list of dozens of words that he overused. Then, when he finished a story, he'd search for each one and see if he could write it out. I don't think it was a coincidence that he began getting nominated for Hugo and Nebula awards within a matter of months. Some words seem invisible to the author, but don't have a place in most manuscripts. For example, modifiers like just. You can almost always cut out just. And then. If you're writing sequentially, you don't need to say, then this happened, then that happened. You just write that it happened. In the sentence, the lightning flashed, then the thunder rumbled. We can take out the word then, but you can also take out other words. In fact, one word that gets overused is the. In the sentence above, we can take out all uses of the. Lightning flashed, thunder rumbled. It ends up being a lot more direct and a lot easier to say, and it creates stronger images. I often see writers who seem to have a limited vocabulary. They use adjectives that every 4-year-old knows. So they describe things like, a little man sat in the old rocker. Little and old, okay? It almost sounds as if the author is trying to avoid surprising the reader with his word choice. Because of this, we need to search for ways to invigorate our description through careful word choices. Entire sentence structures can become boring if they're used too often. For example, earlier today I read a manuscript where nearly every sentence of dialogue ended with the same variation of said so-and-so, okay? Said Sarah, said John. There were no bits of dialogue where the tone was described first, or places where the dialogue was broken into small chunks so that the reader knew who was speaking before the paragraph finished. Instead, the dialogue tags all felt tacked on. Even things like said Tom was not varied with Tom said. So we had the formula dialogue plus said plus character name over and over and over. It got pretty repetitious. Many authors use short sentence structures repeatedly. They may say, the day was gray and rainy, and there was water running in the gutters. The author is stuck in a subject-verb-object pattern, often with a weak verb. Wouldn't it be better to combine some images and strengthen the verbs? Gray rain spattered the pavement, glistening, water burbling through gutters. One trap that authors often fall into is using the gerund form of verbs. To be, okay, they use the to be verb plus the gerund. John was wading through the swamp. crocodiles were sunning themselves on the banks and looking at him hungrily. Do you see the problem? The author gets lots of weak, unnecessary verbs, was and were, followed by a verb that ends with an ing. Worse, though, is the problem of character voices. Most novels have a consistent narrator, the author, who tells the whole story. Rarely does that narrator try to change his or her tone in a novel. In other words, we write in the same voice all the time, and that lends to a sense of consistency to a work, but it can also lead to a kind of audio fatigue for the reader. We have the same narrator droning on and on for 400 pages. Fortunately, when different characters talk, we can get a break from that monotone, unless the writer is so careless that the speakers all sound the same. As early as Chaucer, I've seen comments from authors on the virtue of trying to make the character voices sound different. Tolkien believed that one key to putting a reader into a dream state was to relate your tale in a framework where the multiple narrators are speaking in different voices. I think Tolkien was onto something. Indeed, some scholars have criticized him for writing in very different tones and styles in various parts of Lord of the Rings, but it's obvious that he was consciously altering his narrative tone based upon the area that his characters were visiting. He was trying to resonate with different cultures. I could go deeper into that, but it would take too long. Just see my comments on resonance in the book Writing Wonder. I sometimes think that we might write better if we learn to listen. Many authors like to read their work aloud as part of the editing process. For years I've recommended that you read and write each character's dialogue and any scenes told from their viewpoints separately so that you can catch the tone of their voices and not stray from it. I might add that I think that the same should be done with narration and description. If it comes from the author's point of view, then the author should make sure that he has a consistent tone, if that's what he wants. The whole point of these editing techniques is to fix a problem that hasn't even had a name yet, at least that I'm aware of, and I'm calling it audio fatigue. We want to keep our audio captivating so we can hold our readers rapt.